So I was recently promoted to detective from the patrol division. I wouldn't exactly say there's a lot of downtime, but being behind a desk now, there's certainly a lot more than when I was on the street. Anyway, I was bored one night after wrapping up a case. There was only about 45 minutes left in the shift, and generally they aren't going to dispatch you to anything with less than an hour left, unless it's something big like a murder or bank robbery. I decided to pass the time looking through old police reports for anything good or juicy. Now that they're all on the computer, you can bring up reports as far back as 30 years in just a couple seconds. I quickly found this wasn't exactly the best way to pass the time, and was getting bored after about 5 minutes before I stumbled across a report filed in 2003. This particular report started out as a simple shooting, but quickly escalated to something even bigger and more sinister. After reading it, I asked my captain about it, as he was a patrolman during that time period. Those familiar with this event call it the Doomsday Report. He told me this report was kind of a black eye for the department because of its content and the officer's actions he took during his investigation, to the point where he was not only fired, but later committed to the state psychiatric hospital. Another detective who assisted him also resigned as a result of this investigation. My captain also asked that I not go around telling everyone in the department about it. It's not something the department would like brought back to light. Since I can't really talk about it at work with anyone, I'm going to post the officer's entire report for you guys to read here. I could potentially get in trouble for this if anyone from the department happens to love such videos and is familiar with the event, so I'll be redacting certain names and locations. Since there will probably be a lot of redactions, anybody with what I would consider a common name will not be redacted. Police report redacted, filed by Detective Randy. 16:30 hours, July 1st, 2003. On the date and time stated above, I began a murder investigation occurring at a warehouse. Patrol Officer Johnson responded to a 911 call. Shots fired in a warehouse. He, along with several other units, arrived to find Marcus as the perpetrator. Upon police arrival, Marcus surrendered both his weapon and himself without incident. The victim was Hassan. According to interviews conducted by the patrol division, Marcus and Hassan had a verbal argument over Marcus's son, and it escalated to Marcus brandishing a firearm and killing Hassan. It was noted in the patrol report that Marcus was very calm at the time police arrived on scene. I ran Marcus through the police system prior to my interview with him. He had no prior record of any kind. Prior to beginning questioning, I read Marcus his Miranda rights. He declined to have a lawyer present during questioning. I reiterated to him that he was the prime suspect of a murder investigation with multiple witnesses, and that representation is strongly recommended. He again declined. Marcus started off by saying he belonged to a group of religious fanatics that have rented a portion of the East Warehouse for several years. He stated that he shot Hassan because Hassan had intended to use Marcus's son as a sacrifice. I asked if he meant sacrifice in the traditional sense, and he stated no at that time. He stated Hassan had medical training and planned to use sedatives to stop Marcus's son's heart for a period of 2 minutes and 30 seconds. It should be known that Hassan is a licensed medical doctor in the States. I asked why Hassan planned to do this, and Marcus stated that Hassan, a leader of this group, needed a child, one who could be considered innocent, to be declared legally dead. After 2 minutes and 30 seconds in this legally dead state, Marcus stated Hassan and several others with medical training would revive Marcus's son with CPR and epinephrine. Marcus stated during the 2 minutes and 30-second time frame, a CPR compression would be given at intervals so that no permanent brain damage would occur. I again asked why Hassan planned this, and why Marcus's son was chosen. Marcus stated that he initially agreed to the procedure, but became more and more unsteady as the ritual approached. Marcus stated that this ritual they intended to perform was to bring about the apocalypse. I paused at this time to process this information. I then asked if Marcus meant apocalypse as in the biblical sense, and he stated yes. Marcus stated that several years ago, ancient religious scrolls had been recovered from the Middle East by members of his group that detailed how to bring about the end of days. The scrolls of which Marcus spoke were recovered from the warehouse and are currently entered into evidence. I then asked Marcus what his son had to do with this, and he explained further that Hassan wanted a child who was considered slain and brought back to life. I asked for what reason, and Marcus stated one of the scrolls they found that, once it was rolled up and resealed, Only someone worthy would be able to open them and bring about the apocalypse. Marcus did not elaborate on what worthy meant. I then asked Marcus if he shot Hassan because he feared the apocalypse, and he said he did not. Marcus then began explaining the shooting before I could ask another question. He stated he demanded Hassan find someone else because he no longer wanted his son to go through the procedure. He stated Hassan declined, and when Marcus approached what he called the altar to retrieve his son, he was blocked by several other fanatics. It was at this time that Marcus brandished a 9mm automatic. The men blocking his path immediately backed away from him. When Hassan again refused to return Marcus's son, Marcus fired. At this time, I decided to end this round of questioning. I thanked Marcus for his statements and told him to expect more questioning from other law enforcement entities. At this point, I examined the documents Marcus mentioned in his statement. They had been recovered from the warehouse at the scene of the crime. Upon initial examination, they did in fact appear to be scrolls in a traditional sense, in that they had been rolled up and sealed with wax or some other binding agent at some point in time. There were 2 scrolls, one much larger than the other. The smaller of the 2 appeared to have been sealed with only one binding agent, whereas the much larger one required a binding agent in 7 different spots to keep it closed. Both scrolls were written in a language with which I was unfamiliar, and the larger one had writing on both sides. The documents appeared to be very old, so great care was taken when examining them. After examining the documents, I contacted a foreign language department at a university and was placed in contact with Dr. Johann, an expert on theology and Middle Eastern languages. I explained the documents in question, and because of the location they were found, the Middle East, he agreed to examine the documents in an attempt to uncover in which language they were written. Dr. Johann arrived at the precinct at 8 o'clock the next day. Upon initial inspection of the documents, he stated he recognized the language. He continued to examine the documents before stating to me that they were written in Aramaic, an ancient Middle Eastern language in which he was fluent. He then began to discuss their subject matter as extraordinarily interesting. He asked where they came from, and as he was now an official expert consultant of the investigation, I was authorized to divulge part of Marcus's statement about their origin. Dr. Johann wished to know exactly where they were found, and I stated I would talk to Marcus again. He also stated he would like to consult his colleague Dr. Abraham, the president of the museum and an expert on rare books and antiques, which included very old documents. Dr. Johann stated he wished to have Dr. Abraham examine the documents. As with his, Dr. Abraham's expertise, they could not only date these documents, but also verify their authenticity as either true, ancient religious texts or simple, elaborate forgeries. Dr. Abraham was officially consulted at 0830. Dr. Abraham arrived approximately 25 minutes later, as he stated he had not had any prior engagements that morning and was able to come right away. I contacted the patrol division to see if they could spare any officers to stay with Dr. Johann and Dr. Abraham while they examined the documents together while I was questioning Marcus about their discovery. I stated it was simply standard procedure to have an officer present while evidence was being examined by civilians. Officer D. Jones stood by with the 2 professors while I was out of the room. I questioned Marcus about the exact location the scrolls were found. He stated the larger scroll was found in a hidden crypt deep underground in the sewers of Jerusalem. He did not know by whom in his group or how the crypt was discovered. The scroll found in the crypt was in a chest and had been wrapped very carefully in order to help protect the scroll from degradation. Marcus then stated the smaller scroll had also been found in a chest, which had been uncovered on the seafloor of the Dead Sea in the Middle East. He again did not know who in his group found it or how it was discovered. It is also unknown how the chest remained airtight to keep the water out based on the apparent age of the document and its current state of preservation. I then returned to Dr. Johann and Dr. Abraham, who were deep in conversation with each other. I asked Dr. Abraham what his expert opinion on the 2 documents was, and he stated that, based on the parchment itself, the type of ink or writing agent used, and the overall appearance of the documents, it was his opinion that the documents were anywhere from 1800 to 2000 years old. I then asked Dr. Johann about the subject matter of the 2 documents, and he stated it was utterly fascinating. The larger scroll contained information dealing mostly with the wrath of God and the final judgment of humans. He stated scrolls written on both sides, as the larger one was rare. I asked if anything mentioned the apocalypse, recalling Marcus's earlier statement, and Dr. Johann responded with, "Oh yes." He stated the entirety of the subject matter of the larger scroll dealt with the apocalypse and final judgment. He stated what was even more fascinating about this scroll was that it very much resembled a biblical scroll from the final book of the Christian Bible, the Book of Revelation. Dr. Johann then went on to describe the Book of Revelation. In it, a man named John apparently witnesses God and high-ranking angels gathered around a scroll. He stated this scroll had writing on both sides and required 7 different seals to be opened to be able to be read fully. Each seal would reveal a section of the scroll to read, and the next seal would then be broken in order to continue. With each seal broken, a deadly force would be released in which after all 7 were opened, Armageddon would commence. Dr. Johann then took to the large scroll and pointed out that this scroll also had writing on both sides and contained 7 broken seals that would have all had to be broken in order to fully open the scroll. I asked if this could be the scroll described in the Bible. Dr. Johann stated much testing would need to be done to declare such a finding, which would be an incredibly revolutionary discovery. But as of this point in time, he and Dr. Abraham believed there was enough evidence that this scroll could be the scroll as described in the Book of Revelation. The scroll containing the wrath and judgment of God upon the non-believers and sinners, systematically opened by Jesus Christ by breaking the 7 seals. The end result after Armageddon being the second coming of Christ. I stated that I was going out on a limb, but I asked if Marcus's group of religious fanatics were attempting to bring about Armageddon by somehow resealing this scroll and then opening it again. Dr. Johann stated that could not be the case. I asked why, and he stated that not only were the original seals sealed by God, even if they did reseal the scroll, they would not be able to break the seals, or if they did, it would not bring about the desired effect. I asked him to elaborate. He stated the seals could only be opened by someone worthy. In the Book of Revelation, only Jesus Christ had been found worthy. I then recalled what Marcus had said earlier about someone being worthy. I asked Dr. Johann what made someone worthy, and he stated Jesus was worthy because he had been slain. He had died for our humanity's sins and was resurrected. I then went through my notes again, recalling Marcus had said something about being slain and brought back to life. I informed Dr. Johann about Marcus's statement and asked his opinion. It was his opinion that Hassan's plan was to attempt to use Marcus's son as a makeshift Jesus. Marcus's son would be clinically dead for over 2 minutes, thus slain, then resurrected, thus becoming worthy to open the seals. Dr. Johann stated while this sounded somewhat inventive as a plan, it was ultimately utterly ridiculous. He continued that Jesus Christ died for everyone's sins and was resurrected with the Holy Spirit with divine purpose. Dr. Johann reiterated that no created being, as in God creating man with Adam and Eve, would ever be worthy to break the seals. It was not just that Jesus was slain and risen, it's why he was slain and how he arose. I then asked Dr. Johann that if this scroll was in fact the scroll from the Bible, it had already been opened. Dr. Johann agreed. He stated many theologians agree that the events of the Book of Revelation have already happened. He then elaborated on the seals themselves. The first 4 seals released the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. He stated that the horsemen represented conquest, war, famine, and death. He stated, "One only need to look in a history book to see that all 4 of those events have happened many times over in human history." The last 3 seals dealt with tribulation and destruction, most of which he stated could be explained by natural disasters and cosmic phenomena, solar eclipses, etc., occurring and wiping out large numbers of people in a given area. Dr. Johann then turned his attention to the smaller scroll. He stated it was also written in Aramaic and also dealt with judgment. This scroll only contained information on the 4 horsemen and did not mention any other potential disasters. I asked what it said, and according to Dr. Johann, this text did not reference anything in the Bible and appeared to be a standalone work. He stated the text dealt with not only explaining the 4 horsemen and their purpose, but also specific instructions that if completed would summon them into our world, again resulting in the end of days. Dr. Johann stated he did not believe this scroll was an authentic, religiously based document, and further stated that the Four Horsemen were not necessarily corporeal beings that could officially be summoned, but were more of a symbolic entity used to describe how man will destroy itself. I then asked Dr. Johann, for completion's sake, what exactly summoning the Four Horsemen entailed according to the scroll. He stated there was an incantation comprising the final paragraph of the scroll and pointed it out. He stated the incantation was only part of the ritual. The scroll spoke of 4 separate artifacts related to each individual horseman that would need to be present during the incantation: a sword, a bow, a set of scales, and a miniaturized sarcophagus that was carved from stone. Dr. Johann stated that since it has potentially been almost 2,000 years since this scroll was last read, acquiring these artifacts would be virtually impossible. Finding the correct sword or bow especially would prove troublesome since, throughout human history, millions upon millions of swords and bows have been crafted. Finding the correct one would have astronomical odds. Dr. Johann also stated that if someone were to attempt this incantation, the scroll states it must be completed in full or it would fail. All 4 of the horsemen needed to be summoned in order for any of them to remain in this world. I thanked Dr. Abraham and Dr. Johann for their assistance. I told them they may be asked to testify in court, and they agreed to do so should they be needed. Before leaving, Dr. Abraham asked that, given the potential historical value of both scrolls, that he and his team of teaching assistants be placed in charge of the care of the 2 scrolls while in police custody, as to keep their remarkable integrity for their age intact. I ran this by Captain Miller, and she then authorized Dr. Abraham and his staff to be in charge of the handling and transport of said scrolls to maintain historical integrity. I informed Dr. Abraham that once the investigation was concluded, the scrolls would be released to him and his colleagues at the museum. He agreed to these terms. Before leaving, Dr. Abraham stated that, while in his professional opinion, these were genuine ancient religious texts, there was still a very high chance that they were very elaborate, perfectly executed professional forgeries. I again thanked Dr. Abraham and escorted him to the evidence room where he placed the scrolls on the corner table. The next day, I arrived to work at the usual time. At approximately 10:30 hours, Charles from Dr. Abraham's office came to see me about the scrolls. He claimed Dr. Abraham wanted another examination. Charles was shown to the evidence room and Officer L stood by. About an hour later, I went to the evidence room to see if Charles was still there, as he had not checked in to say he was leaving. I asked the officer and she said he had left a while ago. She stated when she looked in the window to the evidence room, she saw the scrolls were still on the table. I became suspicious and entered the evidence room. I then found that the larger scroll had been replaced by a laminated reprint of the United States Declaration of Independence, and the smaller scroll had been replaced by a copy of the Apostles' Creed. I informed the officer as well as Captain Miller that evidence in a murder investigation had become compromised. I contacted Dr. Abraham, and he stated he had not authorized anyone to examine the documents. He stated Charles had also not shown up for work that day. I contacted the patrol division to put an APB out on Charles and his vehicle. Officers were dispatched to the museum in case Charles returned there, as well as to his place of residence. I stated to Captain Miller I wished to check the East Warehouse. She stated we should send a patrol unit instead. I then stating this was my case and I needed to be out looking for Charles as well. She agreed. Detective J. Smith then volunteered to go with me as backup. Captain Miller sent a patrol unit with us as well. As we approached the East Warehouse, we found Charles's vehicle parked outside along with several others. While calling it in, Charles exited the building and upon seeing us surrendered himself. The patrol officer, K. Hunter, placed Charles under arrest and escorted him into the back of her car. Detective Smith and I then entered the building, finding the crime scene tape had been removed. The Fanatic Group, which was never officially named, was using their section of the warehouse as a makeshift altar. It appeared to be a perfect square with a podium in the middle. It had red carpeting. Aside from the windows up very high in the rafters and ceiling area, the main lighting to this section of the warehouse was turned off, and torches instead provided the light. There were several people gathered around the altar who did not turn to face us when we approached and announced ourselves as police officers. There was a woman of Middle Eastern descent standing at the podium before the gathered crowd. On the table next to the podium appeared to be the 2 scrolls removed from the evidence room. I approached the altar and ordered the crowd to disperse. The crowd looked to the woman before moving, and she made a motion with her right hand and they dispersed. I informed her she was in possession of stolen evidence and that she needed to surrender both the scrolls and herself at this time. I then asked for her identity. The woman, Yaji, pronounced Yaji, stated she was Hassan's wife. I asked why she went through the hassle of reacquiring the scrolls, committing a felony in the process. I will be including quotes for verbatim statements as spoken by Yaji. She stated her and her husband fought, as a married couple, extensively about which scroll to read from. She stated that her husband set his aspirations too high. I asked what this meant, and she stated, "Humanity is 50 times more corrupt and evil than it was before the Great Flood. If God swore never to wipe us out again, we must take our own action." She then stated she agreed that Hassan's plan for total destruction via the 7-sealed scroll would not work. She stated she had her own plan that, now that her husband was gone, she was free to put into motion. I asked what this plan was. She stated if we were competent in the least, we would have found someone to translate the scrolls for us. I stated we did, and that we knew what they said. She then stated that her plan was to summon the Four Horsemen as described in the smaller scroll. At this time, Detective Smith, realizing Yaji was not going to surrender and was leading us into a confrontation, radioed for backup. At this time, Yaji reached over to the table on her right and retrieved the small scroll, placing it in front of her. She then began to read aloud in what I can only assume was Aramaic. I attempted to play to her beliefs by stating, "You know you need the 4 artifacts, as described in the scroll." I recalled Dr. Johan's statement that someone acquiring these would be a near impossibility. She then stated in English, "My friend, look around you." At this time, I examined the altar in full. As stated before, it was square-shaped, and in each corner was a wooden pedestal. I glanced at each pedestal, and each one had an item placed on top of it. The northwest pedestal contained what appeared to be a gladius, a short sword used extensively in ancient Roman times. The northeast pedestal contained a longbow. The wood out of which it was made appeared to be petrified. The southwest pedestal contained a dilapidated scale made out of some kind of metal. It had 2 bowls on either side, and appeared to function as a typical scale. The southeast pedestal contained what appeared to be a small stone coffin comparable in size to a standard American football. At this time, Yaji continued reading from the scroll, her voice growing louder and louder. After a few moments, a breeze was felt in the building. What caused this breeze was unknown, as there were no visible open windows at the time. As she continued reading from the scroll, the breeze picked up into what I can only describe as full-scale wind. The torch flames nearby were dancing wildly. The crowd standing near the altar slowly began to disperse at this time. The wind then grew slightly stronger, and I heard Detective Smith behind me ask aloud, "What is happening?" I approached the altar and commanded Yaji to step down. This command was ignored. I then drew my weapon, with no intent to use it, and again commanded Yaji to step down. I was once again ignored as Yaji continued what can only have been the incantation Dr. Johan had pointed out. At this point, I decided to forcefully restrain Yaji for failure to comply. As I took a step towards the altar, I heard from somewhere nearby what I can only describe as a neighing sound made by a horse. The area in which we were standing was not large enough for a horse to be concealed nearby. Startled, I again heard another neigh, followed by what can only be described as a snort, which also, as far as I can tell, came from a separate horse. At this time, I again commanded Yaji to cease reading from the scroll. This command was ignored. I then pleaded with Yaji to stop her incantation after I heard what I later would discover was called a whinny sound from yet another horse. At this time, I also heard what I can only describe as a clicking sound, as if hooves were coming into contact with the concrete on which we were standing. Detective Smith asked me if I was hearing what he was hearing, and I stated I was. At this time, despite the fanatical nature of this statement, I believed Yaji was successfully summoning the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. I recalled Dr. Johan's statement that the ritual must be completed fully, or it would fail. I asked Yaji one more time to cease and was ignored. Due to my own personal fear and safety, as well as the safety of fellow Officer Smith, I fired 2 rounds at Yaji. Yaji was struck in her upper left chest and she fell onto her back. As she had stopped her incantation, The unexplainable wind had ceased, and the sounds of horses could no longer be heard. At this time, Detective Smith rushed to Yazji to attempt to provide first aid. I then radioed to headquarters we needed immediate medical assistance. EMTs were dispatched. Yazji was pronounced dead at the scene. The crime scene investigation unit arrived, as did the evidence collection team. The evidence collector in particular was told to handle both the scrolls and the artifacts on the pedestals with extreme care. I was unfamiliar with the officer in charge of securing the artifacts. Fearing evidence contamination for a second time, upon request he presented what at the time appeared to be an official badge for a police department, as well as an official department-issued ID card, which I verified as authentic with Detective Smith. I was later informed that both the scrolls and the artifacts never made it back to the department. This imposter officer has not been seen or heard from since leaving the crime scene with the evidence, and his identity remains unknown. At this time, both the scrolls and the artifacts are unaccounted for and remain at large. I returned to headquarters for debriefing, and the police-related shooting procedure was started. I was told I would be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation by Internal Affairs on the shooting, as well as the prime evidence in a murder investigation becoming corrupted on 2 separate occasions. The original murder investigation was then handed over to Detective R. I provided all notes taken on the case as well as the contact information for Dr. Johann and Dr. Abraham. End of statement. Crazy that this is an official police report, isn't it? Obviously, my detective nature forced me to do some research of my own. This officer, Randy, is still in the psych hospital. The entire investigation was a disaster, and it's no wonder the department doesn't want it talked about. Marcus ended up walking because his trial was such a mess. I feel bad for Randy. Like I said, he was fired from his job for losing the prime evidence twice, which reading the report sounds like it wasn't totally his fault. But more so, he was fired because the shooting of Yazji was found unjustified. After he was fired, he was charged with manslaughter. But because all he talked about were the Four Horsemen and how he stopped Armageddon, he was found incompetent to stand trial. He was placed in psychiatric care until he's competent to stand trial, but it sounds like he never will be. He refused to denounce that he heard the sound of horses in the warehouse, and as long as he continues to spout that he stopped Armageddon, he will probably never stand trial. The hospital must have someone on the inside in cahoots with the department. Once they found out who I worked for, I was not allowed to talk to Randy, even though I was on my own time in complete, unofficial capacity. I had one more ace up my sleeve, though. I tracked down Detective Smith. He refused to testify in Randy's trial for fear of being brought down with him and for being associated with a case of this nature. He resigned from the department rather than face possible termination for refusing to cooperate with a police investigation. I found out that he now lives about 3 hours away, so on my weekend off I drove to see him. Once he found out why I was there, he slammed the door in my face. I pleaded with him through the door that I was there completely and totally unofficially and off the record, and that I was genuinely interested in what he experienced that day. He was apprehensive, but we ended up talking for almost an hour. He told me, and reiterated that we were absolutely off the record, that he did in fact hear the sound of horses neighing and snorting, and that there was a strong wind emanating from somewhere inside the building on what was an otherwise hot and breezeless July day. He also said he too heard what he describes as clicking hooves on concrete. He denies actually seeing anything resembling a horse or an actual rider. He also showed me his old police ID card. He said the one that whoever stole the evidence presented was immaculate. Every other officer on scene would have looked at it and thought it was real without question. So there you have it. Was Randy crazy, or could this actually have happened? With Detective Smith basically corroborating everything Randy said, it seems to me like this actually happened as was told. Maybe we should be thanking Randy for saving us all. If he hadn't blown away Yazji when he did, justified or not, she would have completed the ritual. And then what would have happened? It's easy to ask why didn't he just run up and tackle her instead of shooting her. But hindsight is 20/20, and if he was indeed hearing neighing, he was assuredly not thinking straight and freaking out. If this did all happen and Randy stopped it, he may be the ultimate unsung martyr for humanity, and no one even knows it. One more thing to think about though. If this is somehow all true and this actually happened, and the horsemen were almost summoned, that means somewhere out there somebody is in possession of both the scrolls and the artifacts. We can only hope that they have somehow been separated from each other and the ritual can't be completed. It's been 16 years now, and if someone is actually in possession of both together, that means the end of days could be any time. It could be tomorrow, or it could be in 20 minutes. What are they waiting for? Are these fanatics even still around? I don't want to think about it, so let's just hope they are separated from each other and will continue to remain so.